It is in recognition of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that we recognize the women of our nation, because he gave birth to a nation as though a woman gives birth to a child. We recognize that divinity of our women in our nation, and giving them that recognition this day is properly fitting. It's rather late, and I want to take my time, I've got some pieces to give, and I know that it's not enough time to give a detail of an international perspective on the topics of basically what we must do during this time and around the discussion of the great separation that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad discussed. But being that we've been in the UN and typically they only give us 2 minutes to speak, I'm grateful for this moment where I get 5 to 10 minutes to speak and share with you information that will help us answer the question that has been presented to us this evening. Why the United Nations? I'll start that. Why the international arena for Afro Descendants? Being that it is the messenger's birthday, I'll start with one of his pieces. And he says, "It is true that the history of our treatment by the devil slave master practically made our parents and ourselves less than human beings. This is why I teach that the main rights we should seek first are human rights." That's the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who wrote that in one of his books. Human rights, the whole construct of human rights is centered around international law. The infrastructure for human rights is established in the United Nations. There is no human rights framework in the United States. And even if there was a human rights framework, even though that the United Nations headquarters is in New York, there is no aligned human rights law along with civil law here in the United States that respects Afro Descendants or recognizes Afro Descendants. Thus, it's very, very important that we advocate our identity and our recognition inside of the United Nations. Another piece that I want to give in this discussion, because we're talking about unity and when, how, why, those questions, those critical questions. I'll go back to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad again before I go inside the UN, when he discusses again, and I used to be, I'm still a minister, but I used to teach more regularly. And this is something from a teaching or that I had given in the mosque in 2012. But it says the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and our Savior has arrived, page 82. The days of Allah mean years of Allah, and not a 24-hour day. It means years. These days are years of judgment, according to the Bible and the Holy Quran, will not run over 20 years. And according to the scientists of Islam, the teaching of the Holy Quran, which are to be understood, the judgment is to take place between 1380 and 1400 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. Now, if we are to conclude that Prophet Muhammad passed away in June of 632 AD, and 1300 years following his death would put us around June 2012. And we know of the significant gains and growth of the nation, the Afro-descendant nation, at around 2012. But the messenger also concludes that the judgment will not run past 20 years. So if we add 20 years from 2012, that puts us around 2032, according to what the messenger has put. That's basically 7 years from now. And I don't want to, say this in a way to cause any false urgency, but I do want to cause some urgency because it's not a question now whether should we separate. It's also a question, should we analyze that others want to separate from us, and what should we do? And you can purely see that throughout the world, and even right here in America where we reside. There's a great separation that exists that does not include our people, and thus is prudent for us to consider our own movements as this discussion or as these things take place. So I add this to the discussion as a form of strategy because time dictates the agenda. Without having a time or focus to work within our movements, we just become open-ended, and thus we become victims to those who do plan. And what we want to do is counter that by having our own plans for self-determination. The Honorable Silas Muhammad put out years ago when we first went to the UN is, where do we fit? And he asked that question to the working group of minorities. And they had difficulty in answering that question, where do we fit? And that's important when it comes to recognition. Are we minorities? Are we indigenous people? Where do we fit? It was in 2001 that the Honorable Silas Muhammad and Queen Mashaki Muhammad in South Africa urged the United Nations to establish a forum where we can establish ourselves, connect with other Black people, other Afro Descendants throughout the diaspora, connect with our brothers and sisters in Africa, and find a place where we can establish our identity. While we did call for and did self-identify as Afro Descendants, what was chosen as a form was the permanent form on people of African descent who do recognize Afro Descendants. However, we recognize that our issues are not primary in that form. However, we do recognize it as a place to work and to exercise our issues before the world community.
2 minutes.
Thank you so much. I knew I would run out of time, but if you would put this in the chat for me, someone, there's a report of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, 4th session, 60th session, dated September 8th, October 3rd, 2025. This is a report that the Permanent Forum just submitted to the General Assembly. I will conclude on this point on page 3. That the report states that member states should establish a global framework for reparatory justice for people of African descent, grounded in international human rights law and guided by the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, among others. It reiterates its earlier recommendation of the creation of a global reparations fund, which should incorporate mechanisms for restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and guarantees the non-repatriation and the centers and will and needs of people of African descent. It should integrate reparatory justice, reparations, with the intersectional approach into national development strategies, including education, land rights, public health, eliminate resilience, and economic empowerment. I conclude that our central interest or issue to rally around for our people is reparations. That is the lead that we as Afro Descendants established in the UN, and that is what made the president of Ghana in his address at the General Assembly want to declare the transatlantic slave trade a greater crime as the greatest crime against humanity. And Africa is moving forward to establish a global reparations fund. And it is Ghana that wants to make the first motion inside the General Assembly, as well as 2026 is the 25th anniversary of the World Conference Against Racism, the Durban Declaration. And will be much happening on the continent to support reparations. I wish I can continue on, but I got to stop. Thank you for your time. Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for that very helpful information. And we must understand that it's still necessary for us to go to the UN, and you're doing an excellent job.